Welcome to the Fuzzy Mike, the interview series, the podcast, whatever Kevin wants to call it. It's Fuzzy Mike.
Hello, and thanks for joining me. Crime is the theme of this episode of the Fuzzy Mike. My guest is a true crime author. Because I always like to try and share some connection I have with the episode theme, I'm going to share with you an unbelievable but 100% true story. It's of a time when I was a renegade. I climbed a water tower, and I nearly got caught. I was a fugitive, on the run. No lie. In high school, my friends Jeff, Eric, Bob, and I, we'd do these things called night missions. They were nothing destructive, but always had an element of danger, perceived or real. Now, on this particular mission, 3 of us were going to climb the water tower in our hometown. We'd not be the first people to do this. The tower was littered. It was a mosaic of graffiti. All we were going to do was sit at the top, take a picture for proof that we did it. And remember, this is an era of no cell phones. So one of us brought a camera. Once we took the photo, we'd climb down. As nefarious activity goes, a rather benign plan. Eric decided that he was going to be the sentry. He volunteered to stay below and watch for any cars. If he saw lights coming down the road, his plan was to shout at us, and we would hightail it out of there. A great plan, in theory. In practicality, not so much. Outside of the fact that we'd be high above ground, we could see for ourselves if a car was approaching. Therefore, no need to even have a ground guard. There were several other reasons that this plan was, well, total shit. First, it's stupid to even climb over a fence topped with barbed wire just to get into an area that says no trespassing. Second, it's even stupider to do this as a foursome. Who the hell are you showing the photos to? You're doing this with your best friends. They know you've done it because they've done it with you. This is a solo endeavor if there ever was. Third, and to this day, 37 years later, we still don't know what the hell we were thinking we were going to do if we managed to make it all the way to the top and then a car came. It's not like we were going to leap from 150 feet. Best case scenario, you break your legs. You ain't running away at that point. Worst case scenario, any future night missions are basically happening in the afterlife. Then again, well, maybe not the worst case scenario because you can't be held accountable if you're dead. So there was Eric, just outside the fence. Bob, Jeff, and I climbed over the fence, delicately navigating the crown of barbed wire, and we jumped down on the other side. We're in. We started our climb. Bob first, followed by Jeff, then I brought up the rear. Nothing at all suspicious about 3 people in a vertical human centipede formation scrambling up a ladder in a forbidden area. We're about a third of the way up, and suddenly, we have a spotlight on us. A very powerful spotlight being thrown on us from ground level. It ain't your run-of-the-mill flashlight. Then the red and blue flashing lights followed. We never heard a sound from Eric. Some fucking warning system, huh? This unfavorable turn of events immediately presented 2 flaws in our foolproof plan. One, we didn't account for a car that came in dark, lights off. Surprise! Flaw 2, Eric's reason for being there. He can't very well say, "Oh yeah, officer, I'm just standing here to alert my 3 asshole friends who are climbing up the water tower that someone is here." He was fucked for sure. The 3 of us, well, we had a chance. While Eric engaged with the officer, no doubt shitting himself over his predicament, the 3 of us needed to get off the ladder fast, and then the hell out of the fenced area even faster. This was a benefit to me. Remember, I was the 3rd person up, so I'm first person down, closest to the ground. Even in the precarious and panicked situation we were in, I was fully aware that I could not climb down as fast as I needed. I had to improvise, and I did. I gripped my hands around the side of the ladder and stepped off the rung with both feet. I let gravity do the rest. Sliding, I figured, would be the fastest way to descend the 40 to 50 feet to the ground. I've already said, this was an activity without criminal intent. Okay, true. The trespassing wasn't exactly above board, But if you need more evidence that I, at least, had not planned to participate in an unlawful event, you needn't look any further than my attire. I was not wearing gloves. The thought that I might have to dangle my feet and let rusted steel rods rub against my hands in a controlled plummet never crossed my mind. What I was wearing were top of the thigh yellow corduroy Ocean Pacific shorts, a maroon Arizona State t-shirt complete with their bright yellow devil mascot, and Sperry topsiders. Not the typical choice of clothing for a master criminal. Somehow, all three of us managed to make it down and relatively unscathed, save for the layer of palm I left on the sides of the ladder. It was a good few days until washing my hands didn't feel like I was holding fire. So we're on the ground. Task one complete. Next up, climb the fence, traverse the barbed wire, only this time without the luxury of caution, and then sprint across an open field, which is about the length of 8 football fields, to a wooded area that I thought would be a haven. Adrenaline is a powerful drug. With it flowing stronger and more abundant than the waters of Niagara Falls, I didn't feel the searing burn in my palms, nor did I sense how deep the barbed wire had sliced into my shin. In fact, I didn't even realize that my leg had been shredded at all. My only awareness was that I was on the other side of the chain link barrier now, and it was time to run. Time to run like a motherfucker. And that I did. I don't know if this happened because of how fast I ran, but I turned around after a bit, and neither Jeff nor Bob was behind me. I was on my own. I swear, in the daylight, the field ahead was bare and flat. In the dark, ruined with sticker bushes and more craters than the moon. A t-shirt, shorts, and topsiders were now an even more disastrous outfit than I'd previously recognized. After several falls that later necessitated a deep scrubbing of my raw hands to remove the dirt, and scratches from the thicket of thorns covering my legs, arms, and exposed tops of my feet, I made it across the field and was now under tree cover. Good thing, too, because it was then that a helicopter was above shining its spotlight, which felt like it was directly on me. Yep, no question about it. I was indeed a fugitive from the law. As it was turning fall, the trees had just begun shedding their leaves, so there were enough on the ground that I could use them as cover. I piled as many as I could over me and waited. And waited. And waited. Not only was the helicopter above just hovering, illuminating the ground around me with its blinding light, now there were 2 police cars crawling along the road, which was just a half a football field away from me. It seemed like an eternity, but it probably lasted 10 or so minutes before the helicopter left, and I no longer saw the 2 cop cars cruising in front of me. I decided that now was the time to calmly walk along the shoulder of the road to a house I knew a little over a mile away. It was the home of one of my baseball teammates, Jim. As an arch criminal, on the run, I took cover in the woods whenever a car approached. I had to do this 6 times. Of those 6 times, exactly 0 were police cars. You can never be too cautious, though, when you're trying to outwalk the law. Upon making it to the house, I knocked. Jim's mom answered the door. Thinking I was there to see her son, she told me, well, Jim's not home. I explained that I wasn't there to see Jim. I needed shelter. So she let me in. With cuts covering the exposed parts of my body and blood freely running down my leg, compliments of the barbed wire, Jim's mom didn't let me get too far into the house. White furniture and dripping blood do not a good combination make. She got me a wet rag and asked me what happened. Had I been in a car wreck, a fight? Did I lose an encounter with a cluster of cats? In vivid detail, I narrated the circumstances that led me to her door, leaving out one crucial element. The term night mission was never divulged. The thing I needed was for news of these daring feats to get out and create a wave of competition for us. The first rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club. Well, We were Fight Club before there was a Fight Club. After regaling Jim's mom with the particulars of my harrowing escape, she offered to have Jim's dad drive me home. That was where I should have been taken. But as it was just 10 p.m. and I had an hour to go before my curfew, no fucking way was I going home. I asked to be dropped off where all the area teens gathered on weekends, McDonald's. There I saw Bob, Eric, and Jeff. I had an idea how Bob and Jeff eluded the authorities, but Eric? They had him dead to rights. I made my way to them. I don't know what was celebrated more, the relief that we were all back together or the pride that we felt having stymied the St. Louis County Police Department. Curious how Eric got out of the jam? Yeah, so was I. So I asked him. I envisioned him pissing himself as he was coming up with a lie regarding his presence. Turns out, he was calmer and cooler than I gave him credit. Eric told the questioning officer he was out looking for his lost dog. Now, I don't know why the officer bought that. As detail sticklers as the police are, he had to have known this was bullshit. Eric didn't have a leash, he didn't have a flashlight, and he was standing in one spot. I've looked for a lost dog before, and I know the one thing you don't do is stand in one spot. Looking for a lost dog? You move. Did we do any more night missions after this? No. No, we didn't. And had the three of them decided to continue with these escapades, I would not have joined them. Getting that close to being caught? Well, lesson learned. This was the end of my criminal career. We're going to talk about more crime today with my guest, as she's written a book about one of the most notorious criminals in American history. Robyn Maharaj joins me after a look at some headlines. In the news, despite Travis Kelce's newfound fame, thanks to his budding romance with Taylor Swift, Kelce isn't the most Googled athlete in the U.S. this year. In the past 12 months, Americans have Googled the Buffalo Bills' Damar Hamlin more than any other athlete. This according to Google's roundup of the most searched for public figures in 2023. When told he was the most Googled athlete, Hamlin responded that he was so shocked his heart nearly stopped.
Oh, no, he didn't.
I can't believe you just did that.
A Texas high school principal was arrested after he allegedly attempted to pay $90 to have sexual intercourse with an undercover detective taking part in Operation Naughty List. It's just a travesty. He's a principal. He could only afford $90? Man, educators are so underpaid.
I work hard for the money. So hard for the money. Oh, I something money. Come on, give me lots of honey.
And finally, Boston Mayor Michelle Wu defended a holiday party for elected officials of color after an invitation was accidentally sent to the entire city council. According to Wu, it was only supposed to be sent to 6 minority council members. Wu went on to explain that she's, quote, looking forward to celebrating with everyone at the holiday parties we will have besides this one. So, no white people can go to this party, but the colored people can go to all the parties? Hey, that's an extra party for the colored people. Looks like someone's going to have to throw a whites-only party. Wait, that would be discriminatory.
I'm extremely confused. You're confused. I'm fucking confused, bro.
Me too.
In the summer of 1991, a Milwaukee homicide detective sat in an interrogation room for 16 hours per day, talking with a murder suspect named Jeffrey Dahmer. The book, Grilling Dahmer, The Interrogation of the Milwaukee Cannibal, is taken from the nearly 50 pages of notes Detective Patrick Kennedy compiled from his 6 weeks of conversation with the killer of 17 victims. 5 days before he unexpectedly died in 2013, Kennedy turned over his notes to my guest, Robyn Maharaj, who used those notes and Pat's memories to tell this story.
Hi, Kevin. How are you?
I am fantastic. So excited to be speaking with you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciated all of your emails and messages and saying you got the book and you were reading it and enjoying it. So I appreciate that.
I can't put the book down. It's absolutely the way that you set it up with Pat. Okay. It's ideal for this ADD world that we live in. Short chapters.
Yeah.
But riveting
Okay.
material.
Yeah. Well, it's really, what it is it's the access, right? Like Pat was in that room with Jeffrey Dahmer all those weeks and got to know him really well. And I mean, anybody could write about someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, but to have the access that Pat had and be able to tell his story. Yeah, I agree with you.
Before we get into the book, I want to talk about how you got into writing true crime, because you and I have something very similar.
Oh, okay. What's that? Are you going to tell me after or before?
I will tell you now because I know the
Sure.
story. The first true crime book I believe you read was Helter Skelter.
It was, yeah.
I've read it twice, and I did a book report on it too.
Isn't that hilarious?
It was
kindred spirits, Kevin.
I believe we are, because you spell your name exactly the same way my sister spells her name. We have this passion for true crime, and we both did book reports on Helter Skelter. At the time though, I think that was probably the only real book that I remember about true crime out at that time.
Yes, yeah. Like, I mean, it's definitely a genre that has burgeoned over, they say, the last 20, 30 years. And I mean, the Helter Skelter book, I mean, not only is it telling a fascinating story, but it was, again, really well written, riveting. Like, I mean, it was just a page turner, I felt. And I mean, I was young. I was like 18 years old or 17 years old when I read it. And probably one of my very first true crime books, if not my first true crime book. And I was sort of hooked at that point.
Well, it was written by Vincent Bugliosi, who was the prosecuting attorney of the Manson family. And this book that you've written, Grilling Dahmer, The Interrogation of the Milwaukee Cannibal, is written based on the notes of the lead interrogator, Patrick Kennedy. How did you meet Pat?
I met Pat back in, I guess it was early January of 2013. And how we met was through email, essentially. I had wanted to write an article, a true crime article. I had decided at that point I was going to sort of try it out and see if it worked. And I mean, I loved reading it, but I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a good writer at it. So I just sort of thought I'll do an article, and I chose Dahmer because I had some ideas about him that I kind of wanted to talk to somebody about in terms of, kind of, am I on the right track? Am I completely off base here? And so I actually reached out to a young filmmaker. He was a documentary filmmaker. His name is Christopher. And he actually lived in Milwaukee. He was very young when the whole Dahmer story happened. I think he was like 10 or 11 years old. But as he got older, he decided he was going to do this documentary film. And so he actually met Pat. And Pat became one of his lead interview subjects for the documentary. So when I reached out to Christopher and I said, help, I'm sort of doing this article. I'd love to talk to somebody. He said, you have to talk to Pat Kennedy. Because not only is he the guy that was in the room with Dahmer, but he has so much background and information and so many resources that you could probably use. He'll be a great interview. So he actually put us in touch through email. So we actually went back and forth with emailing for a few months. And then he actually invited me to come down to Wisconsin in April of 2013. And there was a film festival in Madison. And he said, why don't you come to the film festival? You'll see the documentary film. We can have our interview and chat and go from there. And so he, at that time in our emails, had actually said, I've kind of written something. It's a bunch of notes, whatever. I've kind of gone as far as I can with it, but I'd love for you to look at it. And if it's helpful to you for your article, great. And if it's something we can work on together, perhaps in the future, great. So that's what I did. I went down, drove down there. And I mean, for someone like yourself who's done interviews, sometimes you can do these so easily, right? You can call, you can do a Zoom meeting or Teams or whatever. But there was something kind of driving me in my mind, and I don't even really know what it was, but I was just like, I have to go down there. I could do this interview over the phone, but I really, really want to meet this man and sort of have him meet me. So we did this over the course of a Saturday. We had dinner and we did this interview, and then we went to the film. And I guess he gave me all of his notes to look through. And so I had done this really extensive interview, but he gave me all of his notes.
How many pages was that?
It was probably about 60 pages or so, give or take, maybe 50, 60 pages altogether.
Yeah.
And so I got that copy, and I traveled back to Canada, and I was in the process of reading it, actually. He and I kind of connected again once I was back at home, and just kind of said, thanks again for this wonderful interview. It was great to meet you. And then about 5 days later, exactly 5 days later after we met, I found out from Chris, and then it was in the paper in the Milwaukee Journal, that Pat had a heart attack and died. So he was at home. He was only 59 years old. He had this fatal heart attack and passed away. And when I looked at the calendar, I couldn't believe it actually, because I myself had had a heart attack. I survived, obviously, but I had had a heart attack on the exact same date, like April 18th was the date. So I was like, wow, like this is just a really strange connection to have. But I went ahead and I continued to read through his material, even though I knew he had passed away. But I just sort of felt compelled to. And so I made all my little notes as if he was going to read them. I sent all of my kind of my edits or my suggestions to his widow, saying, I'm not sure if someone's going to do something with this, but here, take this for what it's worth. I sent her a copy of the published article, and she said, you know what, you really got a good handle on the relationship between Pat and Dahmer. She said, do whatever you can with it, because she said, it's just going to go back into his desk drawer. Like she said, I'm a nurse. I'm not going to do anything with this. If you can do something with it, great. So that's what I ended up doing. And it took a couple of years to kind of work on it and add to it. And I mean, there wasn't a page of his that was not compelling, but it did need to have some, a bit of structure and
You
a bit
got
of
to streamline it.
organization.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. But I really, really was intent on keeping it in his voice, and I don't think it would have worked otherwise. Right. So that came out and originally came out as Dahmer Detective in 2016, mostly in Canada. But then in 2021, Wild Blue Press said, we'd like to take a look at it and, publish it and make it available to a wider audience. And so that's how that came about.
That's how I found out about it, through Wild Blue Press.
Yeah.
Three things I want to touch upon in that answer that you gave me. Number one, so you had a heart attack on the same day, but a different year, obviously, than what Pat Kennedy had.
Yeah.
This was in 2013 that he passed away. In 2012, you became a family member of a victim of homicide.
That's correct. Yeah.
How did that play into your writing of Grilling Dahmer?
In some ways, I guess it kind of triggered my idea of writing true crime, because so often when you read these things, you kind of think like, is this okay with the family? Like when you think about the victims, is this okay with the family? And I'd always wondered that, it's one thing to be a journalist and tell a story, and especially when you're talking about someone as infamous as Jeffrey Dahmer. But I guess it kind of propelled me a little bit, because it's kind of like, it's important to tell these stories. In the case of all the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer, they caught the guy. So there's got to be a certain amount of relief to that, and sort of a certain amount, I don't like to use the word closure, but I mean a certain amount of resolution in knowing who it was. To this day, we still don't know who murdered my uncle, and I don't know if we'll ever find out. It was kind of one of these situations where he was asked to provide evidence, and I think the people that he was going to be providing evidence against came to get him, and that's essentially how it happened. So we have family who kind of look into it every so often, ask the police in Trinidad, is there any more news? But it's been a long time, and we haven't really heard anything there. But being the family member of a victim, I think it kind of gives you a little bit of an insight in terms of how it feels, and also to why it is important to tell these stories.
You chose to write about Jeffrey Dahmer in 2013. That is 22 years after his capture. I give you major, major credit for wanting to write about Dahmer, because pretty much everything's been said or filmed or released about him. Yet you found an interesting way and a unique approach to writing about him with Pat's notes. Did you want this challenge?
Yeah, I guess so, because what I wanted initially in the original article that I wrote, but also what I was hoping would come through in the book, and I think it did, because Pat and I had quite a lengthy conversation about it, and that was, like Dahmer, he kind of gets put in there with the category of serial killers, and obviously he is a serial killer, very, very infamous. There's no two ways about it that, he is one of these guys who did horrible things. But unlike other serial killers, I kind of felt like there was something else motivating Jeff. Like, say if you take a look at someone like Ted Bundy, like he had a lot of anger towards women. And so, the victims of his crimes are women. And I mean, there was a lot of anger and rage in what he was doing. He was punishing his victims. With Jeff, I see this more as, he was looking for a partner. He was looking for a boyfriend. He was looking for a companion, somebody who would love him and that he could love. I mean, he had a lot of requirements as far as being in a relationship with him. He didn't like confrontation. He didn't like to be told what to do or how to do it. He didn't really want he liked the sort of the sweetness of a relationship, and he kind of liked the companionship, but there was a lot of aspects of a relationship that he just was not capable of. And so, but I mean, ultimately it was luck. Like he really felt abandoned. He felt lonely. And I guess that's what I wanted to explore was that, he wasn't sort of playing games with the police. Once he was caught, once he was realized this is over, he actually contributed greatly to the investigation. Because if you think back, you mentioned so many years later, back in 1991, they did not have the DNA and the technologies that we have today. So they really relied on Dahmer to be able to identify these victims, because most of the victims were pieces of people, if you will. And so they needed him to sort of say, we need you to timeline this. We need you to tell us who you met based on pictures, when, how, everything about it. And so anybody else might have just sort of said, forget it. I'm not participating in any of this. But he kind of went along with it. He said, if I can do that to help, I will.
And Pat Kennedy, in your book, he was amazed at Dahmer's ability to recall dates and times and victims.
Yes,
this is a 13-year period that
That's
Dahmer
right.
operated.
That's right. Yeah. And you have to admit that, in terms of him and his state of mind too, like through most of these encounters, he was drinking a lot. Like he drank a lot of beer. And in fact, that's how he, I think, was able to do what he did. So based on, the fact that he was intoxicated most of the time, and it was over the span of a great deal of time, that he actually did have that memory and able to recall it to the detectives.
You used one word earlier when you were describing Dahmer and Pat Kennedy being in a room for 6 straight weeks, 16 hours a day. You used the word relationship.
Yeah.
In the book, it does kind of sound like Pat Kennedy was somewhat sympathetic to Dahmer. How can that be?
Yeah. Well, I think it's kind of funny because one of the things that Pat commented on is I've met people who've done a lot less in terms of, like their crime spree, who were a lot more, angry, and they were a lot more, like they weren't going to talk to the police. They were rude. They were, like they were sort of all over the place and just kind of shut down. I think the interesting thing about Pat is that he treated Dahmer like a person right off the bat. Can I get you a cup of coffee? When was the last time you ate? How about a sandwich? Cigarettes? You need some cigarettes? Like he really treated him well, I guess, if you will. And also sort of said, like, I'm not here to judge you. I'm here just to take your story. I just want to find out like what happened and when it happened and why it happened, if you can tell us. And I remember one time mentioning to Pat, like when we were interviewing and stuff, and I kind of used the word relationship, and he bristled a little bit, because I didn't say friendship. I said relationship. I think even that, he was kind of like, but I guess the more he thought about it, it was a relationship. It was sort of a period of time, very intense, very serious, and very convoluted and complicated. But I think ultimately you're right. He did kind of feel, I don't know if a fondness for Jeff is really it, but I mean, the fact that Jeff took to him and said, I will talk to you and you only. I think that meant something to Kennedy as a detective, because it kind of reinforced what he'd always believed in, is if you kill them with kindness, they will give you what you need in return.
Early in the book, we learn that Dahmer would only talk with Patrick Kennedy after their first encounter, after the first interrogation. Was it the chief or the captain wanted to take Pat off of the interrogation and move a more experienced person in?
Yeah.
But Pat was willing to step aside, but the detective, was it the captain or the chief that came in and said, no, he's talking with Pat now. He's going to continue to talk with Pat.
Yeah. I think that person actually really discovered there was a rapport here and said, let's not exit on this. Let's actually make sure that they actually continue to talk, because the suspect is talking. And what they found out afterwards, and I don't know if they kind of picked up on this intuitively through Dahmer or not, but when they talked to his father and other people that kind of knew Jeff, they said, anybody else, like somehow Pat, when he came into that apartment earlier in the evening, the two uniformed police had wrestled with him on the floor, right? And so they'd kind of gotten down and dirty with him. And when Pat walked in the door and he was in plain clothes, that's what Dahmer said to him, are you going to beat me up too? And Kennedy said, no, because I'm just here to kind of like talk to you and just sort of figure a few things out here, and got him up on up off the floor. And so I think there was something there. It was very minor and short, but there was something there that kind of told Dahmer, this guy is going to treat me like a human. And but everybody else around Dahmer said, so often in an authoritative position, he would shut down. Like he would just shut up and not talk. They would talk to him and cajole him and tease him and whatever and try and get him talking, and he just would just not say anything. But I think the fact that Pat just really said to him, I'm not here to judge you, and was really kind to him, that really went a long way for Dahmer. And Dahmer, I think at that point wanted to please please Kennedy in terms of, like, this is working, we are talking. And I think with Dahmer, he had never really talked about any of this before with anybody. And so it was interesting that the detective was the first person that he ever spoke to about it.
I have read countless stuff on Dahmer. I've watched a lot of documentaries. I watched Monster, the Netflix show. Your book is the first time that I've ever heard Dahmer own up to being a homosexual.
Yeah.
That Pat got that out of him right away.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
He was very, very closeted for a long time, and I didn't even know that he actually came out and told Pat that. So this is the kind of insight that you're going to get in the book, written by my guest, Robyn Maharaj. The book is called Grilling Dahmer, The Interrogation of the Milwaukee Cannibal. By the way, if Pat Kennedy wanted to kick Dahmer's ass, he could. If Pat was like 6'7", wasn't he?
Yes, yeah.
He was a true gentle giant. A true gentle giant.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
You had you brought up Dahmer's dad, Lionel, who just passed away not too long ago. How much culpability does he have in all of this?
Oh, that's a great question. It's interesting because obviously, like when you see Lionel Dahmer in interviews and you sort of see him, he seemed like a very nice man. I think he was very shy. I think he shared a lot of those traits of Dahmer, or Dahmer, I guess, inherited those traits from Lionel, which was, to be kind of shy, a little bit introverted, not comfortable in social situations. And so I think that, Lionel had a lot of sympathy for his son because he could kind of see himself when he was younger. Yeah.
How much of that sympathy, though, was because he abandoned his son, and he also was the one who taught him how to use chemicals to take flesh off a bone?
Yeah, that's right. There could be definitely a certain amount of guilt there, for sure, because that is one of the things that I've said is, I think it comes across in the book, and certainly Pat kind of clarified it for me, and that is that even though Dahmer's parents were there, like they were present in terms of the household and around, actually not so much, because as you pointed out, Lionel Dahmer was away a lot. He worked very hard. He was sort of constantly in his lab and doing work. He kind of checked out of the marriage pretty early on because he felt he had a wife who was just really hard to manage. I mean, she had issues with mental health. And so often she was like either hospitalized or at home and medicated, sleeping a lot. And so even though you kind of have this feeling of like, well, his parents stuck together for a good chunk of his life. Eventually the father did move on with another woman, and that actually was his stepmother, who also, I think, passed away earlier this year or late last year. There was sort of this family unit, but it was fractured because, they kind of were around, but they weren't around, if you will. And I think, a certain amount of Lionel's feelings toward his son after everything came out, and his feeling of like, I'm going to stick by my son. And, to the very end, yes, he did some terrible, monstrous things, but he himself is not a monster. It's hard to say. I mean, a father's love, it probably was very much a real feeling, probably a certain amount of guilt, as you will, because I know Pat said, like, he found it very strange when he talked to Jeff, and Jeff saying, oh, well, when my dad used to show me these chemicals and how to take things off of bones. In Lionel's defense, I guess, he felt like he had a little protege on his hands. He thinks that he's a chemist. His son is now turning into an interest in chemistry. It was a little bit odd. And in fact, that's what Pat said. He said, I found Lionel to be very odd. And if it was my son, I think I would have asked some questions. Why do you want to know this? Why are you so interested in this? Because as Jeff put it, the beginning and right up until he was caught, he was interested in the insides of dead things. So, if you have a young boy who's saying these kinds of things to you, maybe it's let's go out and play ball for a little while. Let's go and shoot some hoops and maybe not focus so much on this kind of dark, because it was a very isolating pastime. If you think about it, he's roaming the streets of Ohio, sort of byways and old dirt roads, and finding roadkill to bring home so that he can do these little experiments in his little shack. And it's like, I guess in some ways, Lionel kind of felt very familiar to him, because when he was at that age, he kind of isolated himself, but felt that eventually Jeff would grow out of it. He said, he learned how to be, as Lionel said, he learned how to be a sort of more normal person by talking to people, asking questions, getting people to talk about themselves. But he said, I learned these lessons late in life. Jeff is probably a slow learner too. Eventually, he would, as he would say to the family, his grandmother and his and Jeff's stepmother, eventually he'll be a nice girl and he'll settle down. Of course, none of that happened.
None of that happened. No. We talked about the word relationship in regards to Dahmer and Pat Kennedy. This is the second time I've heard you say the word love in relationship to the killings that Dahmer did. I heard it in a previous interview that you did, and you just mentioned it, that these were killings out of love. Explain that, please.
Well, okay, out of love. In terms of that, I think what drew him to find victims was that he was looking for a person. He was looking for somebody that he could have a relationship with. Pat did say, and it comes out in the book, why didn't you just find like a normal guy and have a normal relationship, Jeff? Well, he wasn't really capable of that. He didn't really have the experience. His sort of experience with adult relationships and interpersonal relationships was kind of frayed, if you will, because I mean, he really only had his own parents as an example of sort of how adults interact when they're married, and he always said, I'm never getting married because all people do is fight when they're married. So, he didn't date, he didn't have very much experience, and I mean, part of this is because he was gay. And at that time, it wasn't really that easy, maybe for people to come out as it is now. So he really kept things very secretive and very quiet. But yeah, I mean, what he did is not loving, obviously. What he did to his victims is not loving. And in the end, he was actually quite violent, like he's strangling people, suffocating people. But I think, and ultimately, when he was out looking and cruising, he was really looking for someone that, he was attracted to, that would be interesting to talk to. He was such a lonely guy, he was such a lonely, introverted guy that, he would stroke his victims, right? Like they would be passed out or dead, and he would be holding them and he'd be hugging them and wanting to hear, like to see if he could still hear their heartbeat. It doesn't seem like the typical behavior of what we'd call your normal serial killer. So me, I sort of saw it as, yeah, he was a serial killer and he killed people, but it just seemed like it was not out of an angry place. It seemed like he was really, really trying, like he would try and keep those victims with him,
Yeah, because he didn't want people leaving him.
That's right. Exactly. He had serious abandonment issues, right? Like his mom who was around, but not around, his father who was kind of there, but not really there, So people, all he really knew is how people abandoned him all the time. And that's not what he wanted. He wanted a relationship where the person would stay.
Did Pat ever get the feeling that Dahmer loved him in that respect? Because Pat didn't leave. Pat was with him 16 hours a day for 6 straight weeks. Dahmer ultimately got what he wanted out of Pat.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, I guess amongst the cops, there was a lot of jokes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like there was a lot of things, they were putting pictures up of Dahmer, in Pat's locker on his desk or whatever, and just saying, oh, you've got this guy who really, really is into you. And, he's only talking to you. That must mean something. So there was sort of a certain amount of jokes and everything. Pat never really said that. Like he said, like he felt that that Jeffrey really appreciated his friendship. Like I think Jeff thought of Pat as a friend. I don't think Pat thought of Jeff as a friend necessarily, no. But I think that that Jeffrey definitely did. And who knows? Like in one point, Pat says, "I just don't think I'm his type," because he wasn't long, lean. He wasn't African American. He was like very almost the opposite of what Dahmer looked for. But I think there definitely was an affection on Dahmer's part towards.
You just brought something up that I was going to talk about for sure, and that is the racial component of Dahmer's victims. 17 total victims, only 3 were Caucasian, the rest were persons of color. Is that one of the reasons why police let him go with Connor X and Thansum Phone that night in May? If the roles were reversed, do you think it would have been a different stop?
Yeah, I think so. I think that race in many ways, played into this because at that time, and this is according to Kennedy, they were sort of trained to kind of identify those people in a community at a situation who they felt that they could talk to the best, get the best story from. So in this case, in 1991 and 1990, it was the white guy. The cops that were showing up were white men. The guy that they're talking to is a white guy. And the victim doesn't speak English. He's slurring his words. They can't really understand him. The other thing that Dahmer kind of had going for him is that he was very deferential. He was very polite. Yes, sir, no, sir, and so he didn't kind of come off in their faces. He just acquiesced as much as he possibly could. And so they just thought, here's a nice guy. This is a nice guy. If he's telling us that this is his boyfriend and he's got proof upstairs, they didn't really sort of see any reason to doubt him. They could have looked up his file and probably should have, just to see what kind of a background he had in terms of, criminal activity, if any. But they didn't. They kind of just trusted him on his word. And I think that, after Dahmer was caught, there was a lot of outrage in the community because was it so much that he was choosing Black men as his victims? According to Dahmer, he was not racist. He said, I just love the way those bodies look. Like if you looked at his artwork, he had artwork in his apartment and pictures. And when he'd look through magazines, the pictures that attracted him most tended to be sort of lean African-American men. But I think that the other part of that outcry from the community was really that, here are all these family members and different people coming to the police saying, our loved one is missing. They went out one night and they never came home. And the reaction they were getting from law enforcement was, oh, well, they probably just took off. They'll come back one day. They probably just decided to leave the family and go elsewhere, and there wasn't really a lot of sort of serious attention paid to these disappeared men. Like if they were finding bodies all over the place, different story. But I mean, Dahmer was keeping his victims in the apartment and doing things with them there. So there wasn't really, these were men that had disappeared, but they weren't necessarily homicide victims. And I think to the police's, sort of defense, they were looking at these pictures of these young men, these victims or so-called victims, and saying, this is a guy who's not going to get into any trouble. Like he will be able to handle himself, right? It would be different if the victims were old ladies, children, women, because it's like, okay, maybe they don't have the defense mechanisms to fight back, but these are all strong young men. So they would be able to fight back if they were in any kind of trouble. So yeah, I think, race did kind of play a lot in terms of how people felt Dahmer got away with a lot. But to be honest, as Pat said, he lied. He was an expert liar, and he could really kind of charm his way out of situations. He had a lot of experience kind of talking his way out of trouble with police before. So there was really, he took that chance, like with that one situation with that boy outside the apartment who was naked. Dahmer could have just kept walking, right? Like he could have had his beer in his hand and just kind of kept walking, past the street and past the situation. But he went right up to the police. What's going on? Is there a problem here?
Well, that begs the question, and I was going to ask this. What compelled Dahmer, who did not like confrontation, who was very shy, what compelled him to walk up to the police officers that night and interject himself into this conflicting situation?
Well, the only thing I can really think of is that he had been drinking a lot that night. And so maybe it buoyed his confidence in terms of, doing this situation and maybe it didn't even occur to him really that he could have just walked away. Maybe he felt like I got to get back in there and I got to somehow convince the police that this is okay, that the situation is okay. But you're right. It could have been all done that night, actually, had the police maybe done a little bit more due diligence. They listened to the ladies who were there and saying, this is a boy, this is a teenager, this isn't some young man who lives with another man, this is a kid in school. And because they were kind of emotional and maybe like loud, they kind of just, they didn't listen to them. They listened to this guy who sort of, I just went out for beer and I thought he was passed out and I come home and I find this and, this has happened before. And, he's got sort of all the patter down, right? But you're right. It does sort of fly against what we think we know of Dahmer. But honestly, I think it was the booze. I think he had drunk so much that night that he just kind of felt just inspired that he could get away with it.
That was the second time that Dahmer was close to being caught. The first time was with Stephen Hicks, his very first victim. How did that come about? And we're going to talk about how that came about. And then we're also going to go back because you and we know so much about Dahmer. I just flippantly threw out Conarax and Phantom Foam. People might not know that case, that story. So let's talk about how he evaded capture the first time with Stephen Hicks, and then go back and talk about the 14-year-old boy Conarax.
Sure. Well, when Dahmer was about 18, 19 years old, had just graduated from high school, he was kind of, I guess, abandoned. We'll use that word. By his dad. Like his mother had already taken off. She had left with the younger son, David, and they had gone to Milwaukee because they were still living in Ohio at this time. And so I'm 100% convinced that the mom, Joyce, said to Dahmer, like, I'm not talking to your dad right now. I'm upset with him. I'm pissed at him because he's left. He's off with another woman now, and I just don't want to have anything to do with him. Tell him that we've gone and that he can move home now. I don't think that Dahmer did that. I think he kind of liked the idea of, hey, I've got the whole house to myself. It's summertime. I can do what I want. I can drink all day if I want, do whatever, right? I don't have to be worried about somebody kind of seeing what I'm up to. And I mean, as a teenager in their late years, I mean, that would be like a really nice opportunity, right? So I don't think he did anything. I think he just kind of said, okay, mom, I will. And they took off. So he was left alone in the house. The dad was living in a hotel and he had his, new relationship. So he was focused on that and work. And so Jeff was kind of left to his own devices. So one day he's driving around his neighborhood, his area, and he comes across a hitchhiker, a young man named Stephen Hicks, as you mentioned. And he says to him, where are you going? And he's like, oh, I'm off to a music festival. I'm meeting some friends. And so Dahmer says, well, hey, if you want, hop in the car with me. I'll take you back to my house. We can have some drinks. I've got some weed. We'll just kind of hang around and joke around, whatever. And then I will drive you to your friends and the festival. So this was an offer he could not refuse. So he did that. He went back to Jeff's house. So they were kind of hanging around in the afternoon and drinking and doing whatever, kind of wrestling around. And this young man is saying, like, I got to go. I got to go and meet my friends. They're expecting me. And Jeff, didn't want to be left alone. He did not want this guy to go. And so they kind of got into a bit of a tussle. And Jeff ended up picking up a weight, like the iron part of a weight set, and hit him in the head. And now I honestly don't think he meant to kill the kid. I think he actually just meant to stop him, prevent him from leaving, not maybe knock him out or make him pass out or something. But the hit actually killed the boy. So Dahmer's now left. He's like 18 years old. He's got this dead body in his house. Oh, at first he's very excited about it because, here is this kind of dream, right? Like he's always wanted kind of an incapacitated man that he can kind of explore, do things with to the body. And there's not going to be anyone to say, no, stop, don't do that, or that hurts or whatever. This was his victim. So he did whatever he was going to do, then realized I've got a real problem here because I've got this body and I've got to get rid of it. So he sectioned off the body. He put it into a bunch of different big garbage bags. And one night he put those all into his car. So he's driving and he's headed towards the dump near where he lives. And a police car pulls him over and says, you're swerving, you're kind of drifting into the other lane. What's going on? Have you been drinking? So Jeff sort of very cool, calm, says, yeah, I had a couple of drinks earlier this afternoon. I'm just actually driving some garbage out to the dump. My parents are divorcing. My mom is very upset. And I just thought this would make her feel better. I was supposed to do it earlier, but I forgot. So I'm doing it now. So the cop, is kind of leaning in. He asks for his ID. He's got the flashlight and he's kind of like looking at the bags, but doesn't do anything, doesn't ask about them, assumes, I guess, that they're garbage. And sort of says to him, well, lets him go because there's really no reason for him to hold him. Like the guy's given him, giving him some excuses as to why he's there. So he tells Jeff, like the dump is closed now and you can't leave the bags outside. So you better just go home and do this tomorrow. So Jeff says, thanks. And away he goes. He turns his car around and heads back home. So this was an encounter, sure, that if Jeff had panicked, if he had said the wrong thing, if he had said something rude, who knows what would have happened. This detective might have detained him. But he didn't. He said, it's okay, you can go. And he did. He ran the name, and that's about as far as that went.
This is one of the stories that you'll read early in the book called Grilling Dahmer, The Interrogation of the Milwaukee Cannibal. It's written by my guest, Robyn Maharaj, and it's written on the notes of Detective Pat Kennedy, who was the interrogator of Jeffrey Dahmer after his arrest in July of 1991. We talked about the 14-year-old Laotian boy. Describe the details of that, please. It's horrifically sad, obviously horrifically sad. But it allowed Dahmer, with the police kind of mishandling it, it allowed Dahmer to operate for another 2 months.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he ran into this young man. And as it turned out, I mean, this was completely kind of a fluky coincidence, but he was actually related to another victim that Jeff had had. That boy had actually survived. No, but I think they were cousins or something. But this family had already been sort of aware of Jeffrey Dahmer because his other victim had come home with Jeff. Jeff had picked him up, and this is a few months earlier than the boy you're talking about, but had brought him home and had given him some liquor. He was way too young for this, but had given him some liquor and then had been fondling him and taking pictures of him. And he had let this boy go. And so the boy, of course, went home, told his parents, the police were called. So he did actually have sort of a record of this kind of thing in terms of, endangering of a child or molestation of a child. So there was a record of that. But when he met the 14-year-old boy that you're talking about, he didn't realize that he was as young as he was. He figured he was like 17, 18 or 19 years old. He didn't realize that this was a young boy. He just sort of felt that his body type was very much in keeping with his nationality, perhaps, that he was very slight, very small. But yeah, he suspected and he told the police. I always thought he was an older boy and didn't realize he was a teenager. But he had brought him back home and, had kind of given him some beer and he had taken some pictures. And there was actually pictures of the boy, kind of with his glass up and kind of, cheers and this kind of thing, looking very happy and very, very much comfortable being there. And so he was doing different things to this boy and, sort of sexual things and touching and photography. And Dahmer ran out of beer. He just ran out of beer. So he figured this kid is kind of incapacitated. He's kind of passed out. I can leave him. I can go away for 15 minutes. I can go get some more beer and come back. So he did. He just left the boy there naked in his apartment and he went to the beer store. So this kid woke up and he's been in a bit of a daze. He has been drinking because Dahmer's been giving him things to drink.
Not only drinking, but Jeffrey Dahmer used to put a substance in the drinks. What did he spike it with?
He had gotten a prescription actually from a doctor for halcyon because he had read about George Bush the First needing to take halcyon during the very first Persian Gulf War. So he had read about it and it was kind of, it helps me knock me out at night is what the president had said. So Jeff had said, because he works nights, he has a hard time sleeping during the day. Could he get a prescription for this as well? And the doctor gave it to him. So yes, you're right. He would drug the boy. He would drug all of his victims actually, which would really incapacitate them. So Jeff went off to the beer store and this kid wakes up and he's naked. He doesn't know where he is. He's confused, just kind of like really in a bit of a daze. And so he gets up and gets out of the apartment and he makes his way down outside. So it's a nice night and there's people outside on the street and some women who saw him come out of the building naked. They saw him as being bruised and bloodied as well. So they went running over to him and said, they covered him up with I think it was like a windbreaker or something. And they started asking him questions and they were trying to, kind of get something out of him. Meanwhile, somebody else had called the police and the police had shown up. And so they were saying to him, this guy's in trouble. This boy's in trouble. And then that's when Dahmer showed up with his beer in hand and basically talked to the police, giving them an opposite story saying, no, this is my boyfriend and he's of age. And I have identification of him upstairs. He just happened to pass out. He was drunk earlier, and I thought it would be okay to sneak out and get more beer. But obviously, he woke up and came downstairs. And the women are insisting that, no, this is a boy. He's in high school. He's a victim. And police are just kind of like, we believe him. And so Jeff convinced them, if you come upstairs, I will show you his identification. So they ended up taking this boy who had managed to escape Dahmer's lair. They had one arm on each side, basically, and they kind of brought this poor kid back up to Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer didn't actually have his identification, but he had photographs. He had Polaroid photographs that they'd taken earlier in the night that looked as though this boy was having fun and that they were together. And this seemed to be enough to convince the police, that and Dahmer's kind of patter and charm, that they were okay in leaving him in Dahmer's custody.
Pat knew those two officers, and he talks about them in the book. After the arrest, and after it comes out that the boy was a victim of Dahmer, how did those two officers cope with that?
Probably to this day, they probably have so much guilt about it, and it was not even just the fact that they returned the boy to Dahmer, but they actually got in their car and they're calling back into the office and they're making all sorts of jokes about the gay lover has been returned, so it was just really kind of bad on all angles, right? It just did not there was nothing really good that you could say about this. It was a boy. They were making jokes about homosexuals. Dahmer was a serial killer and they basically delivered him right back. He had managed to escape, but they delivered him back. So I think it was a lot of, there was a lot of defense, they were very defensive about their position. But once the calls were leaked and they were out in the media, I think it kind of had to change their tune about it. And, there was a lot of, what ifs, I guess, a lot of sort of second guessing decisions. And then certainly a lot of training went into how do we avoid this kind of thing happening again. And really like sensitivity training in terms of all areas, sort of all marginalized areas and communities. But with Pat, I think he had a lot of sympathy for them, initially just because their names were put out there and they're sort of being crucified in the media. And he himself said, I think as a cop, had I been there that night, I would have done a little bit more. I think I would have at least run Jeffrey Dahmer's name just to see, what are we dealing with here? Can we trust him? But he said he kind of felt they got swept up in it a little bit. They're sort of trying to, hush these one set of ladies up, and they're trying to listen to what Dahmer's trying to say. As they said, we didn't understand this boy. He wasn't speaking English. His language was slurred. We couldn't really get anything out of him. But yeah, it was just sort of a series of really, really bad decisions that kind of led to this unfortunate situation.
All of these details are found in the book Grilling Dahmer, The Interrogation of the Milwaukee Cannibal. My guest is Robyn Maharaj this morning. She is the author, along with Pat Kennedy, the lead interrogator of Jeffrey Dahmer. One of the things that struck me as really, really, well, it was terrifying, actually, is how Dahmer basically just flippantly told about how to peel skin off of a skull. I mean, he routinely did this in his apartment. They found 4 skulls. Pat is a seasoned veteran at this time, still rather young. He's only 3 years older than Dahmer at this time. How did he not flinch?
That's a good question. I think a lot of, he must have had to deal with it, right? And I think actually writing a lot of this out helped him a lot. Because, he said after the fact, he would kind of come back to it. People would want to interview him and he'd have to kind of refresh his notes. He went on actually after the Dahmer case, he went on to continue with Milwaukee Police Department and homicide for 10 more years. And then in 2001, he decided to resign. He went back to school later in life, and he actually became a criminologist because I think for him, he thought so many lessons here that we need to get organized and learn from in terms of the Dahmer case. I mean, Pat was sort of forever branded the Dahmer detective because he was the media person. When anybody ever wanted to do a documentary or a show or a news program or anything, article about Dahmer, the Milwaukee Police Department would say, you have to talk to Kennedy. He's the guy. So he kind of always had this, even right up until the week he died, Pat was talking about Dahmer with me. So I think writing it out helped a lot. And I think just really realizing that, to blow up at Dahmer, to get upset with Dahmer, to kind of say, what the hell are you thinking? Or what were you doing? I think he just realized that is going to just have a bad effect on Jeff. He's going to curl up and just sort of into a corner and just not talk anymore. And we need him to talk. We need him. So I think he was very professional and friendly in the interrogation room. And I think that he just sort of found his own way, whether it was talking with the other detectives, writing it out and trying to kind of get it off his chest a little bit. He did see counselors, like some of the detectives that were really closely involved did see some like therapists afterwards. But to be honest, Pat sort of said like he didn't really feel like he got that much out of it. He just sort of said, as a cop, you see things, you hear things, you encounter things. And I mean, for him, he said, as bad as all the Dahmer stuff was when it was happening, he said what really kind of turned the corner for him as far as deciding, I don't think I want to be a police officer anymore, was actually seeing like babies, infants that were left abandoned in apartments because of drug, mothers, basically, like mothers abandoning their children. And he said, how many times can you come across a crib and see like a dead infant? Like it's just, for him, that was really what kind of turned the corner. With Jeff, it was, it was obviously a very horrific case and it kind of blew up, right? I mean, he became one of those notorious serial killers. Yeah. And I guess he was always sort of curious about it. Like he would say to me, or when I met with him, like, what's a nice Canadian lady like you doing, asking about Jeffrey Dahmer? But he realized the significance of the true crime story and potentially what could be learned from it. And so I think that's really how he kind of worked it out in terms of like, it happened. We have to learn from this somehow. We have to figure it out. And so he became a big champion of training and law enforcement and learning the lessons from that case.
The book opens with the call that Pat and his partner get that there's a head in a refrigerator at apartment number 213 in the Oxford apartment complex. Take us through when they get there.
They get the call. And I mean, it's one of these things. And I love stories like this, right? Like where you kind of, it's sort of one of those fate things. Like it could have been any detective, right? Like it could have been anybody who got that call. Just happened to be Pat and his partner. They were up next in the rotation. The call comes in and the captain comes in and says to them, you guys are up. And basically he said, this is what the call is. It's a couple of uniformed officers. They say something about a head in a fridge. You guys got to go check it out. And they started making kind of jokes right away because they figured it was a hoax. They thought it was just a big joke. So they get into their car and they're driving. It's a hot summer night. So they've got the windows open and some air conditioning blowing. And as soon as they pulled up to the Oxford apartments, Pat recognized that he had actually been there not that long before, and it was a homicide, at that time. And so he kind of thought at first, maybe there's something to this. Who knows, right? Like, I mean, getting called to the same building and not too far of a stretch of time, he kind of started to wonder. And so they walk in through the doors, and he said almost immediately the smell of decomposition hits them. And so they said right away, like, we know that smell, and we're very familiar with it. And anyone who spent any kind of a time in the morgue or with the coroner at all, knows that smell. So they're starting to think, maybe there is something to this, so they're starting to go from the jokes to the let's take this seriously. So they get up to the apartment. And as I had mentioned a little earlier, they two uniformed police officers have Jeffrey down on the ground, and he's handcuffed. But he had started to wrestle. Like, as soon as they realize that they have somebody who's potentially dangerous here, like, basically just to go back a little bit, like, how the uniformed police officers got into his apartment was because there was another man who had actually been out on the street with a handcuff dangling from his arm. And so
we're gonna talk about Tracy Edwards here in a moment.
Oh, okay.
He was ultimately the person that brought down Jeffrey Dahmer.
Absolutely. Yeah, he's pivotal in this story. So that he's there as well. But anyways, Pat is saying, okay, like, get him up, get him off the ground. And he's looking a little tousled, shirt's kind of pulled up, his hair is a mess. And that's what Dahmer says to him is like, are you going to beat me up too? Because I guess he looked at the size of Kennedy and thought, oh my gosh, I could be in real trouble here. And Pat said, no, I'm not. I mean, we're just going to get you out of here, and I'm going to go down and talk to you about some of what we found here. And so that's basically their introduction. So Pat was actually through those doors of that apartment with his partner that very first night that they captured him. And then he took, Patrick and his partner took Jeff down to the police station, put him in the room. And then that's kind of when things really started to kick off. They were going in, they didn't really know what they had, they didn't really know what they had. But when he was in the apartment, when Kennedy was in the apartment, one of the cops said to him, look in the fridge, Pat. And so he went and he looked in the fridge, and there was a severed head that was sitting in a box. And that was when I guess he realized we've got something huge here.
Well, and very candidly in the book, he says that hair on the back of his neck did stand up. He kind of shuddered at seeing that in the refrigerator. But you also say that it was then that they realized they might have something. Even while Dahmer, and this is in the book, even while Dahmer is confessing to all of these murders, Pat's like, this guy's full of shit. He's like, there's no way that this happened. He's bullshitting me. How did he realize that Dahmer was true?
Well, I guess it was just sort of like, talking to him and kind of getting those details. And again, not so much maybe the first night, but sort of a little bit later on, they were trying to trick him because they kind of thought, like, there's no way that this guy was doing all the things that he said he's doing. There's no way that he killed all these people and that no one had any clues about it, right? So they were sort of testing him a little bit. But I think it was just the fact that he was so sincere. And then, of course, he's in the room. So he's getting kind of the story and some of the confession. Every so often, he's going outside the room and he's conferring with the captain and other police officers. And they are telling him, this is what we are finding. We have found big bins. We have found body parts. We have found skulls, So it all started to kind of fit together in terms of, like, this guy's not a bullshitter. He's telling us, he's telling us what he did.
What was in the blue drum?
Well, I don't remember specifically the whole inventory, but there was body parts in there, and he had acid in there, and that was one of the ways that he disposed of body parts was he would fill it up with acid and he would put the things in there. And so I think he had 2 or 3 of these drums, and it's quite amazing because he didn't have a car, so he was lugging these things home on the bus. Nobody seemed to be surprised or like wondering, what are you doing? Why do you have these things? Why do you need these things? But he managed to get them into his bedroom, and that's where they stayed. And he would just kind of dispose of bodies that way with acid, and then he would pour out, whatever the contents were in his sink or his bathtub.
It would basically liquefy the flesh, and then he would take the bones that were left over and smash them with a sledgehammer.
Yeah, and he would keep some things, he would throw some things away. He was not the kind of killer that was leaving bodies all over the place.
How did the fact that he went into cannibalism come up in the conversations with Pat?
That wasn't something that Jeffrey talked about actually right off the bat. He didn't. Yeah, he kept that secret, actually. He didn't deny anything, but he didn't sort of come forward with it. And I mean, of course, no one really thought to ask until Pat and his partner were talking to the captain, who had been talking to the medical examiner and saying, we have a conflict here because what we're finding is not really equating with what he's telling us. There should be way more. And so the conclusion that the ME had come up with was that Dahmer had been cannibalizing some of his victims. So they actually brought that information to Jeff and said, like, this is what we think, and this is what we've been told is a possibility. And that's when he told them that, yes, in fact, he had been eating some of the bodies. And they said, well, why didn't you tell us this, from the beginning or on your own? He thought that would make him look bad. So that's why he didn't actually confess that. But once they asked him about it, he told them the truth.
Pat says that and you mentioned this, that they smelled the smell right when they walked in. He gives kind of a description in the book that it was putrid. There was sweetness to it. Have you ever smelled the smell of death? I just can't wrap my head around it.
Not of a person. I mean, I have smelled like a decaying animal body, like just in terms of being out in the woods and you sort of come across something that smells really bad. That's my only experience with it. But as Kennedy said, and I think most detectives kind of agree, that once you've smelled it, you know it. It's going kind of like the smell of coffee. Once you've smelled it, you recognize it in the future. And that actually had been a problem for Jeff. And in fact, he mentioned it to the detectives. The smell was always a problem because people were complaining. But there again, Jeff always had a quick answer. He was always able to deflect. He was always able to say, oh, I had some meat that went bad, or I had an aquarium with some animals that died. And he would just kind of slough them off. And so they wouldn't really ask too many questions. Really, no one ever phoned anyone to sort of inquire about it. He would always give some excuse. But yeah, he said that was always a problem that he had to deal with.
Well, we know this from Monster on Netflix. What Ms. Cleveland, his next door neighbor, complained quite often about the smell. I don't imagine how anybody could have lived in that complex with that horrific scent.
Absolutely. And if you think about the summertime, like Jeff had, I guess, as other people maybe had, just like these little window air conditioners. And often it wasn't really working all that well. And so that night, actually, when Tracy Edwards was in the apartment, he was complaining about how hot it was and the bad smell. And, and I have to imagine that other victims did the same as well.
Well, I watched Tracy Edwards' testimony yesterday in the sentencing. I watched this online. Tracy Edwards actually took the stand in the sentencing phase of Jeffrey Dahmer's trial. Number one, the strength of that man to actually go back into a room with the guy who nearly killed him. Just that guy is impressive. But what Jeff told Tracy while he was in his apartment, he had one handcuff on him, and then he was holding a knife to his back. And Tracy Edwards said, what's the smell? And Jeff told him it was a ruptured sewer line. Now, I know what sewer smells like. So, yeah, I just, that is horrific.
Yeah.
How did Tracy Edwards escape?
A very interesting story. He was picked up by Jeffrey, and it was kind of, by this time, it was very routine for Jeff, right? Like he had the places that he would go. He would scope it out. If he found somebody that he thought looked attractive to him, he would approach them and invite them to come back. Sometimes he would offer money, because he would want to take their pictures and say, you have a very nice physique and I'd like to photograph you. I'll give you money for that. Sometimes it was just an invitation to come back and drink, have a couple of beers, maybe watch a movie. So Tracy was one of these folks that he encountered and had agreed to come back, even though Tracy was with some friends and they all kind of said, oh, go ahead.
Not gay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But his friends were kind of like, this seems a little weird. I don't think you should go. But Tracy, I think it was the lure of maybe money. Who knows? But anyways, Tracy did end up going back to the apartment with Jeff. And I think he just sort of thought of Jeff as like this quiet, harmless guy, and like what could possibly go wrong. But anyways, they get into the apartment, and of course the smell is awful, and Jeff is giving all kinds of excuses as to why it smells bad, and that he's called somebody, and that they're hopefully going to take care of it. But they end up watching this movie. He puts in a movie, and they're watching it. And Jeff fixes Tracy one of these drinks, and he puts in the drug. So he gave it to Tracy to drink, and Tracy just felt that this taste was awful. Like he didn't really like the taste of it. So he kind of feigned drinking it, but he wasn't really drinking it as much as maybe some of his other victims were. Jeff, in the meantime, is drinking beer like crazy, and so he's getting more and more intoxicated. So a couple of times, Tracy was very suspicious. He was kind of like, I think I want to leave. I don't know how to leave, though, because this guy seems very, kind of obsessive about me staying. And, he was asking different questions. And I guess the longer that the time that they were together went on, Tracy was starting to realize, like, this is not a good situation. And Jeff said a few things that kind of startled him. Like at one point he said, I'm going to cut out your heart and eat it. Tracy doesn't know whether this guy's joking or not. Like, he's just kind of like very, very strange. He's just met this person and now he's sort of in this person's apartment and feels very much like he can't leave. Like, he's saying things like, I got to go and I should probably get going. And Jeff's like, no, just stay. Well, what made Tracy different than some of his other victims is that he was not as intoxicated and he didn't have the ingestion of the drug because he didn't like the taste of the drink. So he was more with his wits. Like, he really kind of knew a little bit more about what was going on. And I guess at one point he had the handcuffs on him and he's got his shirt off, Tracy, I mean, and Jeff is just acting really strange. He's kind of chanting. He's saying different lines from the movie, which is Exorcist 3, if anyone's interested. And he's just kind of, just acting very, very strange. So Tracy really just kind of took a chance. Like, he didn't really know what to do. So he just kind of took a chance and he belted Jeff. Like, he just belted him in the face and knocked him over. And he took that opportunity to get out of the apartment. So he ran out of the bedroom, ran out of the apartment door. And he felt, like, I remember him saying he felt as though Dahmer was like right behind him. So it's like a scene out of a horror movie, right? Like, you feel like your life's in danger. There's a guy, he's got a knife, and you think he's chasing you. So he got out onto the street. By this time, it's like well into the wee hours of the next morning. So it's like midnight. And he's actually running down the street and he still has his handcuff on one arm. So he flags down a police car and says, can you get these cuffs off me? I was with this guy. He was really strange and he put a handcuff on me. I just want to get it off. That's all I want. I'm not complaining. I just want to get this thing off. Well, the Milwaukee police looked at the cuff and they said, well, it's not one of ours and we don't have a key for that. We're going to have to take you back to the guy who put it on you. So Tracy's like, no, forget that. The guy's crazy. It smells bad. I don't want to go back there. And they convinced him. They said, don't worry. We're with you. We will go up with you. But that's the only way we're going to get this key to get your handcuff off. So he, as you said, very bravely, very courageously went back with the police and is standing in the hallway when the police are there knocking on Jeff's door. So Jeff is, has been drinking and this guy has gotten away. And I guess he figures that's the end of it. He's never going to see this guy ever again. But here he is, half an hour later, standing at the door with these two cops. So Dahmer's trying his best to, play up the charm, whatever. They said, we want to just come in, get the key, we'll leave right away. And of course, Dahmer does not have the key. He doesn't know where the key is because anytime he's ever had to take a cuff off of a victim's arm, he's cut the arm off. And that's how he's taken the handcuff off, right? So he's never really had to deal with the keys before, but he's pretending. So he's going to a drawer and he's fumbling around and the police are standing there in the apartment. And they are noticing this smell and they can't believe this smell. And what is this smell? And one of the cops happens to notice some pictures that are just sort of sitting on a table and they're looking at them and they're wondering, how did this guy get pictures from the coroner's office? Because I see blood and body parts and stuff. And then they quickly realize that these are pictures that are taken in the room that they are standing. And so one of the cops says to the other cop, grab him. And so they grab him, and that's when they kind of start to wrestle around and get him down to the ground. And he's fighting, like Jeff is fighting back. And that's essentially how they catch him.
You spent so much time with Pat's notes. You know Dahmer's story backwards and forwards. What's the scariest aspect to you?
The scariest aspect?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because as you mentioned, this is such an old case. Like, I mean, God, we first learned of Jeffrey Dahmer back in 91. And there always sort of seems to be some interest in him. Every few years there's somebody who wants to do a film or something, a documentary or something to kind of study him. And I know a few people have asked me, like, honestly, what is there left to say about Jeffrey Dahmer that hasn't already been said before? Why, is there interest in him? But I always sort of fall back on the fact that I think his story actually kind of talks about or sort of includes different issues that are really important, and they're important right up to today. And those are things like loneliness, bullying, sort of feeling disconnected from the world, and feeling disconnected and different from other people, living this life. It's like he had such a wild fantasy life, really. And that's because he had nothing else to do. He wasn't very ambitious. He really, he went to college and drank his way out of college. He was in the army for a while and eventually drank his way out of the army. He really didn't have any motivation. He didn't really have anything that he was sort of striving for. So I think those topics of sort of like abandonment, isolation, loneliness, being able to say who you are, like in Jeff's case, he was really closeted. He couldn't talk about who he was and his sexual identity to anybody. And so I think that these are themes that we sort of still talk about, we still reflect on, and probably are still issues for people who are are troubled, and may go into a path of violence or crime or whatever, just because, it's just because, they don't really have anyone sort of that they can connect with. And that's to me, in terms of the scariness, like the fact that he was a necrophiliac and a cannibal. I mean, it's all very strange, it makes him to be a very strange kind of person to study. But I guess, the fact that he got away with it for so long, that's probably the scariest part, is that there were just so many missed opportunities, that cop that actually stopped him back in Ohio, they didn't know about him. Like, they didn't know that was a victim, right? Like Stephen Hicks, I mean, as far as his family was concerned, for 13 years, they had no idea where he had gone. He had just disappeared one day to go to a music festival, and they never heard anything back from him. When Dahmer was confessing, so back in 91, he's confessing, and he mentions, I killed somebody in Ohio, and he starts to give the details, and he's starting to talk about it. And they figure we better bring in somebody from Ohio and kind of compare these notes and figure out who this victim is. Well, wasn't it not the same detective that stopped him on the highway, that came to Milwaukee when Dahmer was caught? And when he's hearing this story and looking at him, he's thinking, this sounds really familiar. And he realizes, I was the cop that stopped him. And so one of the other detectives said to him, you could have stopped this way back in 79 or whatever, and I mean, the guy just blanched, obviously, but Pat assured him, he said, this guy is a masterful liar, like he fooled a lot of people for a really long time. And, I guess that's scary too. We sort of see people like Jeffrey was kind of like the boy next door, but he had a lot going on.
Well, that was one of the things that struck me in the book. Pat talks about how he was charmed by Dahmer. He thought he was highly intelligent, and he said he was a good-looking guy.
Yeah.
There was no exterior reason to suspect that Dahmer was who he was.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Harmless. I mean, people, I think, before they knew who he really was, described him as harmless, boring, even, bland. There wasn't really a whole lot going on there. It wasn't always the easiest to have a conversation with him because, he was just so shy and into himself and hard to drag things out. There's a couple of videos floating around. I've seen them on YouTube where, it's pictures or a video of him with his family, visiting a grandma and whatever. And you can just see, like he's got a lot going on behind the scenes at that point. These videos with the family were taken. He'd already killed people, but he was just really shy and sly, and he kept a lot to himself.
He killed people in his grandma's house and then disposed of them down the drain in the basement.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Dahmer was killed in prison. He was given 15 life sentences, consecutive, not concurrent, consecutive. And then I believe somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 years on top of that. Did he get his just punishment?
Well, to echo what other people have said, like that's not what prison is for. No one deserves to die in prison. If you're sentenced to life sentences or you're sentenced to whatever you're sentenced to, I mean, that's supposed to be the way it is. Nobody should be killed in prison. But, I think a lot of people felt he got what he deserved. I think even Jeff himself, like when he, in the time that he was sentenced and in prison, he actually got kind of reacquainted with his birth mother. Like Joyce had she didn't really want to have a lot to do with the news of him being captured. Like when he was sort of making all of the headlines and everything, she didn't really want to have that much to do with him. But once he was sentenced and in prison, they reached out to each other and they would have these calls, like every Sunday, Sunday night, they would have a phone call. And she would always ask, how are you doing? How are things going in prison? And he would just say, it's the worst place. Nobody wants to be here. No one wants to live here. This is, and he, in fact, had said to Pat a couple of times, I wish we had the death penalty in Wisconsin because I deserve it. I deserve, to die for what I've done. I've caused so much grief and so much pain
he actually begged Pat on numerous occasions to pull out his gun and shoot him.
Yes, yeah.
I didn't
And
know
I
that
think,
until I read your
yeah.
book. I did not know that.
Okay. Yeah. And I think because once he was caught, once he was captured, it was kind of like, well, what else is there for me to do? I'm just going to rot in prison. He was a relatively young man. I mean, he was only in like 31 or whatever. So he was a young man and he had a long life potentially to look forward to being in prison, So I think he was very much, I think he resigned himself to that, but I don't think he was very happy about it, but he certainly felt he deserved to be put away. And he said, probably if I hadn't been caught, I would have kept going. He admitted that about himself. So he was not in a happy place, obviously. And I think that in the last year of his life, like he went from being in solitude, like solitary confinement to the general population. And the guards and the prison warden and everyone is telling him, like, that's a suicide. Like, if you do that, you are going to get killed for sure. He didn't care. He basically said, I'm going to take my chances. Pat and his partner, once they learned of his decision to be moved into the general population, echoed the same thing. They said, he's not going to survive. Like, they will come after him. And in fact, that's what happened. He was kind of notorious in prison, and a lot of people were upset, mad, like he victimized all these people. He was getting a lot of mail, like he was getting a lot of like fan mail, I guess, if you will, from people who were writing to him in prison. And he would make jokes, like he would kind of make a little bit of off-color jokes. So I don't know over there he was really liked that much in prison. He certainly made a few friends. He was very close with the pastor, at the prison. But yeah, he basically one day was asked to clean a bathroom, him and another prisoner. And they were both actually attacked and killed by a third prisoner. Whereas the one prisoner had like defensive wounds, like he had marks on his arms, and you could tell that he had been trying to fight back the blows of the weapon. Jeff did not have any of them. So he basically stood there and allowed this man to beat him to death.
We talked earlier about the racial component of the racial makeup, anyway, of Dahmer's victims. Wasn't that one of the reasons why he was killed in prison? He was killed by a black man.
Yeah, I would think so. I would think that as much as Jeff denied that he was racist, I think that they would have had a hard time believing that, or just said it doesn't matter whether you're racist or not. All of your victims, or pretty much all of your victims, were black men. So yeah, I don't think they were a fan of Dahmer for that reason as well.
Authors, screenwriters, writers in general always find something to pick apart about their own work. Is your work completed? Were you happy with the way that your book turned out, or would you have changed anything?
Actually, not at all. I was given the opportunity when Wild Blue Press took it on. They said, if there's anything you want to add to it or take out or change or whatever, here's your opportunity to do it before we go to print. And I did add a little bit because some things had happened in the time between the coming out in 2016 to coming out in 2021. And I did want to address kind of like the whole Black Lives Matter movement a little bit. And just to say, there had actually been a crime where police had beaten somebody to death and, not too long before that. And so this idea of law enforcement and constantly sort of needing to be trained properly and learn all the time, I wanted to make sure that point was given. But honestly, no, like I'm really pleased with the way the book came out. And I think that it really does, like it's so much Pat's story, like if Pat hadn't died, this would have been his book. Who knows how much involvement I would have had. I would have loved to have given him all the involvement that I did give the book. But, it's really his story, and he should be the one that's talking about it and telling the story. So really the only thing that I would wish differently would be that Pat had provided the book.
Well, you did a phenomenal job with the book. It is a page turner. It's one that you're not going to be able to put down. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Wild Blue Press. It's very well written.
Oh, well, thanks. Thank you.
What is next for you? I thought I read that you're going to continue writing true crime.
I am. I'm working on another manuscript right now. It's not one case, though. It's a number of different cases, but the theme amongst them all is the idea of the family annihilator. So somebody who comes in and kind of wipes out their entire family in one incident. So I've got a whole bunch of different cases. Unfortunately, a lot of cases that I'm profiling that kind of fit that. And it's kind of spanning time and location. Like this kind of phenomena happens. Unfortunately, it does happen, but fortunately doesn't happen all that often, that it is kind of a rare thing when you hear about it. But yeah, I'm kind of working on something with that.
Any potential release date?
Nothing yet. I still have so much more work to do on it. I'm still in the research and writing phase.
That can kind of paralyze you at times, though, because there's so much research that you want to do. And you're like, well, how much is enough?
Exactly. Well, in this case, this book is going to be like each chapter is going to be a different case that I'm following. So the research isn't going to be quite, as much as it would be if it was a standalone book. But I do want to kind of put all of these cases together and then get some commentary, maybe from a psychologist, psychiatrist, in terms of, the family annihilator and typically who is that and what is it that drives them to feel. Usually it's narcissism. They kind of feel like their family can't survive without them, and so they're all out. Sometimes these people will try and get away. They do murder suicide. They'll lie and say somebody else did it. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting topic to me because for so many of us, our families are that's our support system, and to have someone turn like that, I'm very interested in that.
Well, congratulations to you on the book. Congratulations to you on making your passion a way to make a living, with true crime and your writing as a freelance artist. I'm just really impressed with you.
Oh, thanks, Kevin. This has been wonderful. I was so looking forward to our chat.
As was I, and I can't wait to finish the book. I've got about 30 pages left. It's only like a 144-page book, so it's a quick read, too, and it is absolutely riveting. So if you're a true crime fan, if you think you know everything about the Jeffrey Dahmer case, believe me, you don't. So there's a reason for you to pick this book up.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin.
You're very welcome, Robyn. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks. Take care.
My thanks to Robyn Maharaj for joining me, and my deep gratitude to you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe, leave a review or a rating. Doing so, well, it might very well get your comment read on a future episode. Please share the Fuzzy Mike with your friends, and as the Fuzzy following grows, the more indebted I am to you. To stay connected with the Fuzzy Mike and get behind-the-scenes content, you can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. For video, please subscribe to the Fuzzy Mike YouTube channel. The Fuzzy Mike is hosted by Kevin Klein. Production elements by Zach Sheesh at the Radio Farm. Social media director, Trish Klein. Join us next Tuesday for a new episode of the Fuzzy Mike. We're going to discuss 3 passions of mine: bourbon, mental health, and music. With Hobby Patterson, he's got a storied career working with Metallica, Queensryche, Tesla, Kiss, Rod Stewart, and the Rolling Stones, all as a production assistant for concert promoters. See you then.
That's it for the Fuzzy Mike. Thank you. The Fuzzy Mike with Kevin Klein.
Fuzzy Mike!